Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Welcome to this month's edition of Conversations with the Dean. In this webinar series, we focus on a range of important topics. And those of you who join us regularly, you know that our discussions reflect our deep commitment to transforming systems, particularly those that are inequitable. We've been really excited and anticipating this webinar for some time, and as you may recall, it actually had to be rescheduled due to a global Zoom outage. That happened 30 minutes before we were due to go live with our webinar last month on April 16th. And so we were very disappointed by that, and really now we are raring to go. So I know we have some of our original registrants on this call, and we also picked up some new folks as well. So welcome. I'm so glad that you could all join us. It's great to see some familiar names and also to see some new ones. I'm also loving seeing how we are growing the audience, and we've got folks joining us from Georgia. Hi, Georgia. Always great to see you. So it is really my pleasure to feature today's BU Wheelock faculty members, Manz and TJ McKenna. They're both innovative science educators here at Wheelock. They both have new books which just came out, and we'll talk about those later. Dr. Manz is an associate professor of science education at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. She supports teachers and young people to engage in learning that build from their capabilities towards new ways of seeing themselves, seeing each other, and seeing the world. Most of her work has been conducted in the field of elementary science education, where she works closely with elementary teachers and instructional leaders to develop new approaches to science instruction that center student and teacher sense-making. Dr. Manz has worked with many school district partners, including Somerville Public Schools. She served on the National Academies of Science and Engineering panel for pre-K to grade 5 science and engineering education, and she contributed to the report and the resulting practitioner guide known as Rise and Thrive with Science. Dr. Thomas, or TJ as we know him, McKenna, is a clinical assistant professor in science education at BU Wheelock. Dr. McKenna has spent the last 20 years as a scientist, educator, both formal and informal, an on-air science communicator and faculty member focused on uncovering what works well in STEM education and how we can improve in scaling research and practice-based efforts. Dr. McKenna is also the director of BU Wheelock's Center for STEM Professional Learning at Scale. And for the last several years, TJ has produced BU Wheelock's annual Curiosity and Learning Conference, which I have to say that I had the chance to attend for the first time last month, and I was immediately sucked into such wonderful wondering and questioning and fun experiments and experiences. So be sure to check it out next year if you haven't already. Welcome, TJ and Eve. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm sure our audience is as well. And please, audience, pose any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to weave them in as we go. So here we go. So TJ and Eve, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you both describe how the approach to teaching science has changed over the last few years, and how that change has informed your approach? Eve, why don't you start us off?
Okay, happy to start and TJ jump in. So TJ and I are super lucky, I'd say, in when we've gotten to be working in science education research. About 13 years ago, a new framework for K-12 science education was published. This was like the year before I finished my doctoral program. And I'm going to highlight a few key ideas in that approach that have then guided a new set of standards published in 2013, adapted in Massachusetts in 2016. So some really key ideas in these standards. One, we need to think about science as a set of important core ideas that develops over, say, like preschool to grade 12, and really be thoughtful about how what children are doing in kindergarten builds the knowledge, say, of matter or of ecosystems that they're going to build all the way to grade 12. So we have a series of progressions for what that can look like that we can orient to at different levels. Two, Science is a set of practices that we can systematically build on over those years as well. So, children from their earliest years of schooling can be doing the things that scientists do. They can be creating models, they can be developing explanations, they can be analyzing and interpreting data. And again, we can think systematically about what that looks like to develop those ideas. And those practices are social. They're done by people working together. So I think once we start to think about these core ideas and these practices developing over time, we can see some really new and exciting possibilities for students and teachers. It also changes the way we can think about equitable science instruction. And so when we start to see science as social and like building on children's capacities, we can really center the diversity of the ways of thinking, talking, doing science that people bring, that children, young people bring to school. We can start to recognize that, like, maybe some of our previous ideas about um, what it means to do science or be a science person were limited. So science isn't being a smart science person isn't about like knowing a particular science term or a fact. It's about contributing knowledge and ways of doing science to a community. And so that opens up like whole new ways to think both about equity and what it means for the science we do to really be meaningful for the youth that we're working with. Um, so I'll talk. TJ, do you want to talk about, do you want to add anything and then talk about how this is approached, how this has kind of changed your approach, and then I can talk a little more?
Sure. Um, I feel like I would echo everything you said, and it really shifts what it looks like when science is being done in classrooms. And so one of those pieces is when you walk in, students aren't passively sitting in those rows, just kind of absorbing the information from a teacher who's explaining things from the front of the room. It's dynamic. Students are arguing, students are drawing, students are thinking about ways to collect evidence, ways to design new investigations, new experiments. And so it really kind of changes the game away from students being, like you said, being a passive recipient of the information and being more active in their learning. This shift that we like to talk about away from learning about the science into figuring out, being active drivers of figuring out that information. And it makes students really engaged, really exciting, really excited, and I think educators love it too because it's like this is why we got into education in the first place.
And so then, like, for me, coming out of grad school and getting into doing science, this kind of like difference in classrooms that TJ is talking about, that's like really fun to figure out how to do with teachers. And also like to learn from kids how to do. So I was a former elementary teacher. Then I went and did my doctoral degree to understand science and math education better. But like with these new standards and these new possibilities, I've gotten to spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, so what does it look like for a kindergartner or a first grader to be engaged in scientific modeling? How does that build from their strengths and interests? Kids play all the time. They use one thing to represent another. So how do we build from that to start having them model how sound travels in a classroom, or to model a outdoor backyard area and to think about how seeds travel within that? Um, what does it like look like, and how do we get second, third graders talking to each other and learning about science from each other? One thing for me is like, well, what can we learn as adults that maybe we've forgotten from looking at second graders or third graders arguing about science? Like, what do we learn about how we want to argue and engage with each other? Another thing that this new view of science has brought up that's really important to me in an elementary space is really like the interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary nature of science. So when we start to focus on how science is useful for young people and for communities, well, it's like really clear that we're going to need to communicate about science ideas in writing, that science and social studies aren't going to be as separate anymore. That we need to pull math into science. And so I've been really lucky to get to work in spaces with teachers where we're looking at a lot of those cross-disciplinary connections as well.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Thank you both very much. I I have to say, harkening back to the conference, the Curiosity and Learning Conference, I entered and was immediately sort of pulled into really interesting conversations and observations, and that really struck me powerfully, because I know we're not supposed to say this as educators or as human beings, that I'm not a science person, I'm not a math person. I would never be saying that in my middle school classroom when I was teaching, but it has been a big part of my identity to not associate with STEM. I much more see myself as in the humanities space. But when I was entering into that environment, surrounded by such engaging experiments and conditions, and surrounded by people who were excited, I have to say that I thought to myself, I could be here. I could see a career in this. I could see myself. It was a really different way of thinking about science. So, TJ, you use the term sense making in your work, and in fact, it's in the title of your recent book. So I'm hoping you can tell us what that means and why it's important.
Yeah, definitely. I think the it really builds on that experience, that like lived experience that you felt at the Curiosity and Learning Conference. It's like humans love to make sense of their world. We're constantly, it's what our brain does, and we're constantly trying to take in all this information, often so much information, and sort through it and make sense of it. And so at the core, sense making is what occurs when you see something puzzling. And I think in the example we shared, talking about today's webinar, it's like we see clouds almost every day, sometimes too many clouds. And but you don't often think that like they weigh tons. Like they're so heavy, but they're floating around up there in the sky. And then if you get in a plane, you fly through them. So like how can a big fluffy thing weigh so much and be in the sky, yet we can fly through it? And so sense making is that process of trying to make sense of the world around you, and giving yourself the time to pause and say, wait a minute, do I understand that? Like, do I understand all of the pieces? Would I be able to explain these pieces? And rather than just being told the answer, you get the chance to observe, ask questions, go social, talk to your classmates, talk to family, friends, and try to figure it out. And so over time, you're not just going to Google, asking the question, saying, why are clouds so heavy? And you get this response, which I think is coming out more and more too with the rise of AI and these language models. That we have access to so many answers. It's almost like we need more access, just to time to think, to be able to have the space to make sense of these things. And in my background, I was an animal behaviorist. I was trying to figure out why squirrels do this lying behavior, where if there are potential cache robbers that were going to steal from them, they lie. They pretend like they're burying something and they put it somewhere else. And it's very interesting. But for me, it flipped the switch of like, oh, this is why we do science, because we're trying to figure out our world. We're trying to be able to explain it. And over time, as you ask more questions, as you start to figure out more evidence, or even design experiments to try to like, what would convince me that I have the evidence to be able to prove this?
Mm.
It's really where the magic is. Like it's this journey of trying to put the pieces together, trying to come up with these different models. And it's really powerful because that is how people learn. That was a really big push in the framework for K-12 science education, is having learning scientists involved, that actually know how humans learn, and bringing those pieces into the standards, so that students can grapple with those things. And I really think that was why it was such a big focus in my book, was like, if everybody does sense making, but not everybody really stops and takes the time to think about that. And if we want students to really learn science and to feel like they belong in science, then we've really got to make space for sense making for both students and for adults.
Mhm. Thank you, TJ. If we had more time, I would ask you how we know that clouds weigh a lot and how we measure that. But since we don't have time for that much of a tangent, I'll have to take that one offline. Eve, I love the phrase that you use, productive uncertainty. Can you say more about what that is and how it might relate to sense making?
Yeah, absolutely. And when TJ brought up the cloud and squirrels example, I was like, oh, and I'm going to build on that for productive uncertainty. So you may get some of the pieces you were just wondering about, because that's exactly it, right? So science is fundamentally uncertain. As like you can see it in how TJ talks about sense making. It's that moment where like it starts with that gap or maybe that thing that doesn't feel quite right. Like how can a cloud be both heavy and floating? But like scientists fundamentally are uncertain not just about like how to explain the world, but how to study the things in the world. So like how do you study why a cloud can float even though it weighs more? How do you conduct an experiment where you can collect evidence of why squirrels bury nuts and like what that subterfuge looks like? What do you do with noisy data? How do you agree on a conclusion? Um, these aspects of science are like fundamental, not just to doing science, but like to the practices that scientists have developed. Statistical practices are developed because data is noisy. Control of variables is a strategy that's developed because comparisons are like hard to make when we do experiments. And so where productive uncertainty comes in for me, it's really a concept to be that I think of as like a concept of for classrooms, a pedagogical concept. And it comes from this idea that like when we go to teach science and particularly to young students, the kind of natural thing we want to do is simplify the situations in which we're teaching them science. So simplify the activity so they'll see what they need to see at the end of it. So they'll come to the conclusion we want them to come to, gain the knowledge we want them to gain. We tend, if we're engaging them in a new practice, like argumentation, supporting a claim with evidence, we tend to think, okay, like, well, let's simplify the situation so that there's like a clear claim and clear evidence they can see. And let's like, teach them, okay, you want to support an argument, you make a claim, support it with evidence. But the problem is that when we like simplify the setting so much, there's actually like nothing left for them to talk about. Um, Children are much more likely to argue if there's like two plausible claims. They're much more likely to use evidence if there's like multiple kinds of evidence, multiple things they could see that could support a claim. And so where productive uncertainty comes in for me is it's this idea that like if uncertainty is what motivates scientists to do the activities they do, we have to use that uncertainty as a fundamental resource for children. And so does that mean we should just say to young children, start designing an experiment? Like we know that's not particularly productive either for them and for teachers. But what my team and I do is we look for opportunities in investigations, in explanations, where there's going to be some kinds of uncertainty that children will recognize and that's going to get them going in their science practice. So I can give like a really quick example of that. In a second grade investigation into how matter changes when it's heated, what we'll do is we'll give children chocolate chips as something that's heated. When those chocolate chips are heated, they like are kind of somewhat in between a liquid and a solid. They like start to look shiny. They get like gloppy. Oh, here we go. Thank you. You remember that's on a slide. And so this is the example on a right. Those heated chocolate chips, when all of you look at them in the audience, you might be thinking like, are they liquid? Are they solid? Um, and what we find is children will start to argue about that in really sensible ways. Like a child will say, "Yeah, heat changes chocolate chips. Look at when they get heated, they're losing their shape. They're taking the shape of the container." And another child will say, like, "Well, actually, no, they're keeping their shape, and they only change their shape when you start to stir them." And we agreed that liquids lose their shape, solids keep their shape unless you do something to them. So those children are starting to like engage in some pretty sophisticated ways in argumentation, and they're actually much more likely to provide evidence in this case of the chocolate chips than when you say to them something like, well, does heat change the state of ice? They'll say, yeah, it's water. And you'll say, well, how do you know? And they'll be like, look, it's water, because it's so obvious they can't really get a grasp on like what it means to argue and support that claim with evidence, basically because there's nothing really for them to argue about. And so to us, to me and my team, what productive uncertainty is is figuring out those key places to build uncertainty into children's experience or young people's experience so that they engage more meaningfully and with more capability in the practices of science. I could provide this second example, but I don't know, because once I start talking about examples, I'll talk forever, Penny. So you choose if you need another or if you have a different follow-up question.
Thank you so much, Eve. Well, I guess what I'd love to hear, maybe you make a the segue to is another phrase that you use, which is cookbook classroom investigations. What are those, and how should we think about them?
So to me, what the kind of cookbook investigation is the investigation where you're basically told every single thing to do so that you will at the end see the claim or see what you're supposed to see. So an example of this is children are a typical third grade investigation or second grade at this point is to ask children to put plants in different conditions to see to examine their needs. So do plants need light? And what we'll typically say to children is like, okay, we want to know if plants need light. Let's control our variables. Let's put one plant in the dark. Let's put one plant in the light. Let's make sure they get exactly the same water. Now go ahead, measure the plant from the edge of the soil to the tip of its leaf. Here's a graph. Put that, put the point for day one on the right here, put the point for day two of the height right here. At the end, let's support a claim with evidence. A claim is an answer to our investigation question. Evidence is what you found in terms of height. What do you think now? And the children can do it. And in one sense, you could say, well, they planned an investigation. They used data. They supported a claim with evidence. But the problem in that case is sort of anything that's different, anything that they don't do that's what you told them to is kind of a mistake that you have to fix because otherwise they're not going to see what they're supposed to see. They kind of know and get into that game. And we all do this game in high school too, right? Where we like follow the procedure, write the lab report, and then you write like why you didn't get what you were supposed to get, and you say like experimental error, um, and you're kind of done. But again, that's an example, that cookbook investigation where you've taken away all the stuff that there is to figure out that would actually allow children to argue. So, like, why are we measuring from the tip of the soil to the highest leaf? Is height actually really the most important form of evidence of a plant's success? What about like the width of the plant? What about the number of seed pods it produces? What about how healthy it looks? These are all those questions, or like what happens if we get different data? Those are the questions that actually are involved doing science and that actually typically get students most interested in doing science most capably. So when we say cookbook investigations, we get why people do them because we want, again, we get very focused on kids kind of seeing the answer. But we're trying to, that doesn't actually support that engagement in practice that we're hoping for.
Thank you, Eve. That makes me think actually, I mean, I can see why teachers do it because it does get you to where you want the students to be, and that's very tempting, and there's a short period of time, and we feel a sense of pressure to sort of cover curriculum as opposed to going in deep. And it makes me think of a phrase that I have stolen from a colleague of mine, Ed Brazee from University of Maine. He said, the problem with curriculum is that it requires students to answer questions they have not asked.
Mhm.
And I just think that's right. You know, that if we were to actually empower students to ask the question and then answer it, we'd be much farther along. But it's not easy. I know that it's not easy. So I'd love to hear about the challenges to this. So perhaps you could each give us some pointers on how you get folks started with this. Maybe TJ, you could speak to how you do this work with pre-service teachers here at Wheelock, and then Eve, I know you've worked a lot with educators and district leaders, so maybe you could talk about that after.
Yeah, and thanks, Penny. I love that quote. It reminds me of like a lot of times what we're trying to do is principled, but it's unscriptable. Like we can't be following this script that exists that doesn't really exist because educators know that classrooms are these like really organic live places where students are bringing all of their different diverse ideas. And so that's one of the challenges. And I think one of the most exciting things, it's literally why I came to BU Wheelock is because we teach our elementary methods courses at the Trotter in Dorchester. And so when I'm working with our method students, our pre-service teachers, we try this ourselves. Like we do sense making, and students are always sharing. I have them do a little activity where they reflect on their own learning experiences, and it always arises that everybody has some form of a post-traumatic STEM disorder where they had a negative experience in some sort of class, and they're like, maybe I'm not good at chemistry, or I'm not good at physics or math or something. And so it takes some undoing to like re-engage in science because as soon as I go to do one of our little mini reasoning experiences for us to play around with something, the big words come out. They're like, I ask, why is this happening? And they're like, it's gravity, momentum, inertia. Is it erosion, weathering? Like they just start lobbing these science words out there. And it's very fun and hard for me to pretend like I know none of them. And I'm like, what do you mean by inertia? What do you mean by gravity? Gravity is different here on the table than on the floor? Like, what do you mean? And so there's always this pivotal moment where students are looking at me saying, I don't think TJ knows anything. Like he doesn't have any answers. And then quickly it shifts into them realizing, oh wait, we need to figure it out. Like for us to be able to teach this, we need to be able to think about our own processes of how do we understand these. And so by starting with modeling it, the students get the shift into like, oh, well, what evidence or what of my explanation or how would I model this to convince myself that I understand this? And then we map that onto, okay, so now we're going to have 25 fifth graders come in. And what would that look like if we do this with those students? And so we rehearse lessons, we plan lessons. I co-teach with Brenda Richardson at the Trotter. And so students get a number of different experiences to try to kind of see what this looks like, feel it, rehearse it, and then they get to lead their own lessons with students where we're really focused on those resources that students bring to sense making. And then we get to kind of break it down, think about like what kind of evidence would convince us that students have learned these things. And it is a big shift because students are used to like, well, what about the worksheets? And what about my slide deck of PowerPoint presentations or Google Slides? And they get to the point where but would that really convince us that students are learning, or is it actually students talking? If we hear the Trotter students actually arguing about meaningful things like Eve has shared, that does convince us because we can really see the kind of ideas that they're bringing to bear and that they're arguing about. And it usually is in those uncertain moments that they're bringing the most kind of meaningful things and often surprising things that you wouldn't expect that they're like making connections to other things that it reminds them of.
TJ, we have a question from John, who is in the audience. Love it when we get our audience questions in. And John actually teaches here at BU. John, it's great to see your name in the chat here. He says, I see many first and second year college STEM students that I need to deprogram their comfort with the cookbook science curriculum. They are hard to shake from that mindset. I believe we are successfully steering them away, but do you have thoughts about how to best address this?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big things, and I use a resource on my NGSS Phenomena website, which I call 30 Days of Science, which is kind of just like this little fake game of going out, playing around with some different ways to engage with the world around you. And it's like a really, really kind of low floor, high ceiling kind of piece. And so if you go into the resource in the chat, there's a bunch of different ideas, and I don't tell most people this, but they're all mapped to the standards. So they're not just random things. But one is like, how far away from the TV can you use your remote? And certain remotes work from different distances, and students will laugh and even email me photos of them down the street using their remote to turn off their TV. And so when they reflect on just doing some of these simple experiences where you don't need a lot of science materials, you don't need a lab coat and safety glasses, you're just kind of engaging with stuff around you. They, at the end of the semester, reflect on, oh, science is everywhere. Like these experiences are everywhere. And I never really give myself the time to pause and say, wait a minute, do I understand that? Like, could I explain that? Do I understand it well enough that I could explain it in a simple way? And so I think the more we go back to creating that space for students to think and argue, and safely wonder, because a lot of the pieces too is about creating that culture. And I think in a lot of our courses there that we think about covering things, we got to check boxes and we have to cover things, but we need to create the culture where students can feel comfortable arguing with partial ideas and coming up with additional questions, and sometimes they have more questions than they have answers, and we have to be okay with that.
Thanks so much, TJ. So, Eve, just to pivot a bit to your work with educators and district leaders, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you do that work, but also I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated because I'm going to layer on a question from Nancy. She's wondering how you balance the cookbook labs you run for learning a specific skill with inquiry-based labs. Maybe.
Yeah, I was seeing that question coming up, and it is one, such a good one, and two, like no surprise, it comes up really quickly when I start doing this work with teachers and district leaders. So I'll highlight like two or three big ideas. Let me preview them. Like one, uncertainty is everywhere in children and teachers' experience, and it's like probably already doing some good work for you. And two, uncertainty doesn't have to be like an all or nothing kind of thing. And so when I start with teachers, what we often start by doing is people reflect on and they actually draw and model like a moment of really great science sense making that got going in their classroom. Like we call these magic moments where just like kids got going, they got talking, something was happening that you felt really great about. And really quickly, when we look across these drawings, we see that one, we all really value student agency, students engaging with each other, students finding science meaningful. And two, we already have examples, so many examples of that happening when there was like something to figure out or a disagreement or people using like one word in different ways and starting to ask each other what they meant. So from there, we can get to the idea like uncertainty is already there and it's already doing good work for us. And so then we start really trying to see the science that we're doing from the children's perspective. And often they're telling us. So we learn to like listen. So when a child says like, well, maybe, or like, well, it did in the investigation, but I'm not sure outside over like 100 years it would do that. Or like, do we need a light or why are we doing this? So we start to like listen for those moments because they're already the moments that children are uncertain that we can build from. So step one for us is often like, okay, what's the uncertainty that's already there? And how does that make sense from the perspective of a child? And then two is, this isn't about like either the cookbook investigation or the like create your own lab and see where you get. Neither of those approaches is like very successful. And so very quickly when I start working with teachers, they say, well, this is where the productive of the uncertainty comes in. How is this uncertainty going to be productive for me and my students? And we say, okay, well, it will be productive if it helps you make progress on a big idea that you care about. And second, we tend to think about like if it establishes a need for a practice or skill that you want to develop with students. And so it's not that the kids are going to need to figure out the whole thing, but they're going to see the need for something that maybe you want to introduce and structure, help them think about. So I'm trying to think like I want to sit down with Nancy, but I'm trying to think of like a skill, she might be thinking about control of variables could be a good example, right? And so we absolutely like use the term control of variables or like fair test or change one thing but keep the others the same with children. But we'll often first do an investigation or get them to where they can see they're about to do an investigation where they might get different results, but they like won't know why they got those results. So maybe they're testing decomposition and they have, used a light over one and not used a light over another of the sort of chamber in which things are rotting, and we'll say, well, do we know it's the light that made a difference? And usually someone's going to say, well, actually, like light's also hot and it dries things out. And so we say, oh, okay, so like here, okay, then we say, what do you think? What do you think? Oh, so like we can't come to a conclusion. Why do we think that is? And they're like, well, it could be the light or it could be the moisture. And we say, yeah, that's a really hard part of science. Often when scientists do something, they end up by mistake changing two things, and then they can't tell. They can't tell the reason they got their results. So that for me is a really good example of where the uncertainty has established the need for the strategy or skill of controlling variables. But we absolutely will then come in as adults and say, yeah, there's a name for this. Scientists then do this thing called controlling variables, or we'll read a story about scientists who have a similar problem, and how they then solve it. So again, hopefully for Nancy, that helps with the question. It's not like they figure the whole thing out, but we really think about how's the uncertainty establishing the need for either the practice or idea. And then when we say as adults, if we need to introduce a term, a book, an idea, a simulation, it's just the students learn from it more deeply, and tend to remember it more as well, and more flexibly use it because they know why they're using it.
Great examples. Thank you so much, Eve. TJ, you do a lot of work with professional development. Is there anything you want to add for Nancy or otherwise?
I think one of the things that I would add was that it's hard. It feels different.
Yeah.
And so when you engage in it, you start to question yourself. You're like, I remember having an experience back in 2015 where I was like, do I not understand the science? Like, I feel like I did. And I drove home an hour without turning the music on, completely had this like mental moment. But I think that was where I was in that productive struggle, like really trying to wrestle with like, oh, I'm good at explaining the ideas and I'm good at giving the answers, but it's a whole different skill set to be able to create the kind of environments that Eve is describing and to create those moments for students to have those ahas. And so I just want to acknowledge that it is different because we're shifting the goal of what playing school really feels like.
Mm. You actually make me think of another question that I have for both of you when you talked about sort of productive struggle, TJ. So, you've both just had these great books come out, and it's all very exciting. You've done this work for a long time. And key to both of your roles certainly is the teaching and scholarship. You're researching things, you're teaching about it. So I'm wondering if you might share with us, just very briefly, what is it you're curious about now? What are you wondering about? What haven't you figured out? What is the thing for you right now? Either one of you, if you want to jump in.
There are like so many answers to that. There are so many answers to that question. I'll say, some ways my team is expanding on our research from this work. We're really looking at what it looks like and what supports it takes for elementary teachers, particularly of multilingual learners, to feel successful in this approach. And so we've become really interested in the ways that the materials, the like actual physical, like materiality, all the visuals and stuff that kids are working with is a really great context for language development and communication for students. And we have teachers in Somerville Public Schools who work in what's called the newcomer classrooms. They typically have like 4 or 5 different languages spoken at once in the classrooms. And so we're studying the ways that those children and teachers engage together around uncertainty, but then also the supports needed at a district level to help teachers take up this approach. And then one other thing we're really starting to think about with a local watershed association, and again, Somerville, is what it looks like when we start to incorporate social questions and social studies aspects. Like, what does it look like to be uncertain about the effects of a choice about how to mitigate heat, and to engage in argument about that, and what does modeling look like when you include complex ecological systems and humans in the model.
Really exciting, Eve. I look forward to reading about that next. TJ, how about you?
Yes, there's so many things. Thank you, Eve, for going first and giving me a chance to think. And I also read one of the questions in the chat, and I think it applies. So one of the things that I'm really interested in learning more about and understanding better is connects to this question about like we've talked about younger learners. How might this look different for high school or undergrad students, or even like adults? Adults, I think a lot of us weren't taught to do school this way. And so, no matter when you went to college, no matter what kind of experiences you had, this does take a lot of time. And I think we're all really trying to figure out how best to do this because we don't have a ton of time. And that's both time in the classroom and time for professional learning experiences. And so, in my work, I'm trying to understand how do we scale some of these pieces that you can do when you're in a room and you have enough time to work with educators over time and this a really long sustained experience. But for example, was in a school in Southern California, and I was leading professional development for a week, and most of the teachers that I was working with had PhDs in their content area. And so this became hard because everybody knew the content and everybody was like, I feel comfortable with the content. I'm strong in my content knowledge. And so I had to pull out all of the bells and whistles of all the different mini reasoning experiences I had. And to create one moment where you question and you're like, do I have the resources to figure this out? And if you don't, I always think of like this mental bucket. If you reach in and you come up empty, you're like, well, what? Now I don't have this, like, I don't have an answer. So now what do I do? And it goes back to like, we need to build these skills moving up through elementary school, middle school, high school, and ultimately, lifelong learning, because sense making is how we make sense of a world that's complex. And once you have these skills, you you feel more comfortable to become intellectually curious, but you need enough time to be able to kind of play in that space to then feel comfortable with it and to know that the answers will come, and not that you have to quick. I need to Google it, and you notice that as it happens, as it happened for those educators in Southern California, they came back and they were so excited by the end of the week, saying like, you've reminded me that this is why I got into education because I love like trying to figure things out. And I think it really kind of reawakens that excitement where you're like, I just love being curious and I want my students to be curious.
That is so great. It is contagious. Curiosity is contagious. That's so great. Um, the only thing I don't like about this job is that there's a timer and I have to be the one to say that we're running out of time. And indeed, we are running out of time. It has been such a pleasure. We have several unanswered questions and wonderful supportive comments in the Q&A. And I would encourage anyone to certainly reach out to Eve or TJ with your questions if we weren't able to respond to them, or with your comments, because I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. So please do feel free to reach right out. Thank you very much, Eve and TJ. Your passion for the work is so clear and evident, and it's been really a fascinating time. And I appreciate your time and willingness to share your expertise with us, especially at this really, really busy time of semester when I know you both have a lot to do. I'm sure you've given our audience many, many things to think about and take back to their classrooms or their workplaces or their homes. I'd also like to thank you all, audience, for your participation. And if you're interested in further study or information, we offer these resources to you here on the slide. We have a very busy May with our graduation ceremonies and events, and we're just delighted about that. But it does mean that we won't see you back here until June 12th, when we'll explore the impact of funding cuts on education research. And if you're an alum, I also want you to know we have a very special alumni event planned on Friday, June 27th, specifically for alums. We'll be touring the Wheelock Family Theater, as well as other classrooms and residence halls on the historic Wheelock campus, which is called the Fenway campus. So really encourage you to check out this QR code on the slide and join us. We would love to see you there. Thank you all so much for making time for us today, and I hope to see you in June. Bye-bye.